Amy stood at the empty bus stop, huddled in her coat. The night air was cold and damp, and the few streetlights along the road cast a dim light. Her bus should have arrived 15 minutes ago, but she still hadn't seen a single car on the road. She checked her watch, 11:48 p.m. "Great," she muttered, shivering. The bus stop was silent, except for the rustling of the wind in the trees. Amy looked around, hoping to see someone, but there was no one around. A few minutes later, she saw a figure approaching the bus stop. It was a man in a long coat, his face half hidden by the shadow of his hat. He stopped a few steps away from her, his hands in his pockets. "Waiting for a bus?" she asked, trying to break the tension. The man nodded without saying a word. Amy felt a slight uneasiness. His silence and stillness seemed strange, but she decided not to pay attention to it. "Have you been waiting long?" she continued. This time, the man turned his head slightly, and she caught the slight movement of his lips but did not hear the words. The silence seemed even heavier. Amy tried not to look at him, but she could not shake the feeling that he was watching her strangely. Amy, feeling awkward, decided not to continue the conversation. But the man suddenly spoke. His voice was quiet, deep, as if coming from far away. "You're waiting for him too, aren't you?" he said, without turning to face her. Amy was surprised. "Waiting for what?" she asked, trying to sound confident. The man smiled at the corner of his mouth, but his smile was not kind. "The bus that never comes." Amy frowned. "What do you mean?" "It's the last bus, and it's probably just late." "It's always late," the man said, now turning to face her. "I've been waiting for a long time." Amy glanced at him. His face looked strange, his skin was pale, his eyes were slightly clouded, and his head movements were abrupt as if unnatural. "And you? How long have you been standing here?" she asked, feeling a chill run down her spine. She clasped her hand together in his strength. "Longer than you think," he answered, tilting his head. "Long enough to know more about you than you know." Amy took a step back. "Excuse me, what?" Her voice became sharp. The man didn't answer, but he began to say strange things. "You think about how stupid it is to stand here at night. You think you could take a cab, but you know why you're here. You know you're trying to escape something." Amy froze. Those thoughts had indeed just been swirling around in her head. "How do you know that?" Her voice trembled. "I know a lot of things," he said, finally meeting her gaze. "I know why you don't want to go home. I know that you're afraid not only of the silence around you, but also of what you'll find there, on the other side of your door." Amy felt her hands begin to shake. She tried to back away further, but the man stepped closer. "You think the bus will come and it will all be over," he continued, "but you don't understand. It will never come, because you are already where you are meant to be." "Oh." Amy took a deep breath, trying to gather her thoughts. She took a step back, trying to keep the man in her line of sight. "What do you mean?" she almost shouted. The man didn't answer, but his pale face twisted into a strange, menacing smile. He raised his hand and pointed somewhere behind her. "The bus," he said shortly. Amy turned around sharply, seeing a bus slowly emerge from the fog. Its headlights illuminated the road with a dim yellow light, and the sound of the engine echoed in the silence of the night. "Finally," she muttered, feeling a mixture of relief and anxiety. She turned to say something to the man, but he was gone. The bus stop was empty, as if he had never been there. Amy felt goosebumps run across her skin. Maybe he just left, she thought, her heart pounding. The bus stopped in front of her, and the doors opened with a low hiss. Everything inside looked normal, but something was wrong. The driver's cabin was hidden in shadow, and she couldn't see the driver's face. "Going?" The driver's voice came, dry and emotionless. Amy nodded, trying to convince herself that this was a normal trip. She stepped onto the bus and noticed that it was empty. All the seats were clean, but they felt cold. The doors slammed behind her. "Route 1?" she asked, but there was no answer. The bus started moving. Amy glanced out the window, but instead of a street, she saw something strange. The trees and roads disappeared, and outside the window there was an endless darkness in which barely distinguishable shadows flickered. "This isn't my route," she said quietly, rising from her seat. But the bus kept going, accelerating. Soon the lights inside began to flicker, and whispers filled the cabin. Amy went up to the driver, but when she looked into the cabin, she was overcome with horror. There was no one in the driver's seat. There was something dark, whose features were impossible to discern. "You've arrived," a voice that belonged to no one rang out. The bus stopped, the doors opened, and a cold wind rushed inside. Amy looked out. Before her stretched an endless plain, illuminated by a deathly pale light. She understood. This is a place from which there is no return. Since then, people sometimes notice the figure of a girl standing at that stop, waiting for the bus that will take the next passenger. Still no bus, except for the one that kept